Before we get started, Bronwyn brought the roster. I think that we have everything up. If you see anything that is spelled wrong or you've got a cell phone number or anything like that, then make sure to provide that information, Bronwyn, so we can get that all cleaned up. John Stanley is no longer able to be on the Charter Commission, so we have a vacancy. We're in the process of filling that.
Okay. Well, it is 7 o'clock, so if whatever button you're pushing.
Yep,
Go.
we're ready.
Okay. I will call the meeting to order. Could you call the roll, please?
Yes. Rod Axtell,
Present.
Ronald Barnes. Hussein Dahir. John Eagle. Kathy Gustafson. Cynthia Hunt.
Present.
Branna Lindell. Karen Lundquist.
Present.
Jamil Mazroth.
Present.
Jeannie McGovern. Emily Melby. Langfala Oreo.
Present.
Steve Peterson
Here.
and Mark Thorson.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we'll take up one appointing and acting recording secretary. Doing help for the reporter. Acting recording secretaries, and there's two agenda items are proposed by the staff. So unless there is any discussion, I'd receive a motion to recording secretary.
That we would, Chair, if I may, we offered up two names here, just for a little bit of additional resiliency. So my recommendation would be that both of them are appointed.
Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
By Axtell and seconded by Hunt. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll come to a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Carries unanimous. Next up, before we go to item 2.2, I want to welcome what's for the commission. Of a, what is it, 4-year project? 3-year project or 4-year project? I hear. 4-year project. Kind of walk through the sections of the charter and conversation about them. So we're kind of doing the first one of 2025. I think we wanted to have like 3 this year.
Yeah, I've got a slide on that. Yep.
3 of them, and then we will have the regular annual meeting of the commission. That's typically the first week in May. Is when that-
Yep.
And then depending on if there are items to be, that get sent to us either by the city council or by the voters. That's our meeting schedule for these. Welcome to the commission. Yep. With that, we'll go on to item 2.2, which is the periodic review of the city charter, and I will shine our attorney.
Thank you. Also, Chair, while you were doing that introduction, I noticed that Commissioner Melby also entered. If you want to have that be reflected in the record as well. And then I think we also have a couple of other new faces here too. I know that we've had a lot of people coming in and out and asking whether they want to be reappointed, and we have an opening right now, a vacancy. So if there are people that you know of that want to be on the Charter Commission, certainly make sure that we know about them or the mayor knows about them, and we can make sure to fill that within the statutory time period. All right, so as was referenced, we are in year 2 of our systematic review of the charter. And last year we tackled 1, 2, and 3, and then our rules of procedure. We made some pretty significant updates to our rules of procedure to modernize them and match them with how we were operating as an organization, as an entity. For those of you that are newer to the Charter Commission is a separate entity. Is in charge of the city charter. And the city's charter is like the Constitution of the United States. It's roughly equivalent to that, or to Minnesota. It has a constitution. It's roughly equivalent to that for the city of Bloomington. So it's at a high level and speaks about things in general terms, often, every now and then in very specific terms. And oftentimes creates a process or a structure for accomplishing more technical, nuanced things on a much more granular level. So tonight, I want to go to the next slide. You'll see the cadence that we're working through. Tonight's chapters, next slide, are four, not all four of them tonight, but teeing up chapters 4 and potentially 6, depending upon how much time we have. Chapter 5, I did not get into in your slides other than to show you the table of contents, so to speak, for that chapter. But I am going to tee it up for you to be thinking about. And suggest that you take a look at it in preparation for the next time that we get together. It's a very meaty, substantive chapter, and really, really gets to the essence of a charter city, creates very specific reservations of powers for the citizens. So with that, any questions before we start chapter 4?
I got one more comment I want to make before we start, and this is more aimed at folks who might be newer. As we're going through and looking at this, you're going to have ideas like we could make that be different. And there's basically 2 ways we can make changes here. We can either make changes that are so uncontroversial that 7 members of vote for them. And so what that means is, I think things that clarify things, or things that if you look at it, like we could go and sell that to the city council, but if any city council member objects to that, then they won't get adopted that way. If we want to make a change and we can't convince the city council, then we have to go to the voters and ask the voters to approve it. And that means we actually have to go persuade people to vote for something. And that's a pretty high bar to hit for something. And so typically at this point in the city where the charter is 65 years old at this point, changes to the charter that go to the voters are typically, for the most part, things that either you can tie some good thing to it that people are like, oh, I want to support that because it'll get us a good thing, or there's some controversy that happens in the city and it exposes a defect in the charter, and it's up to us to fix it. And there's no controversy right now that would fall into that category, but just keep in mind that substantive changes to the charter, like let's say you decided you wanted 9 city council members opposed to 7, we'd probably have to go convince the voters to go do that. Rod?
I think we certainly had conversations around ranked choice voting, but prior to that, I think the one other change that was substantive really was the way the charter was written back in the 50s and 60s, is that it had to be revised to allow a tap room.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was probably one of the changes based upon the original language of the charter. That language did not provide for tap rooms. But it's not very often that there's something like that comes up. I think it's 4 or 5 times, I think, since I've been on the Charter Commission.
And so just the other thing I'll say is, if you got ideas that you think that you might want to be different, don't take this as like, don't talk about them, because we can certainly talk about them. And I do want people to get ideas out. Just be aware that that there's going to be easy things and there's going to be harder things to do if we decide we want to make changes. So that's just what I want people to realize. It's not, we can't just change the charter by all those in favor say aye and it's done. It doesn't do that.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Chair. The other thing I'll offer is that the process by which you can amend the charter is in state law. So there are very specific pathways that are set out in the law about how to amend the charter. And so for the sort of straightforward clerical kinds of things, we make a decision about how we want to proceed. And the cadence of this periodic review is set up such that you all would let us know if there's something in particular that you are concerned about, and so that we can have adequate time to research and prepare some language for your consideration at the annual meeting in May. So the timing of this winter deep dive is on purpose, and tease it up to the annual meeting. Similarly, each year in November, December, January time period, I ask all of the department directors and division heads to read the charter, to remind them of what's in it, and then also to flag things that are of concern or that don't make sense, or highlighting things that we want to just keep on our radar. And so that also happens. This past time, when that question was asked, we received some feedback about some language that there's a desire to change. References specifically to assistant city manager. There's a desire and a request to change that to the deputy city manager, a term modernization. That's much more common to refer to them as deputies. And then the other thing that we have heard about, and our city clerk is here tonight, and we're going to be talking about elections, is some communities are looking at changing to even year elections for a whole variety of reasons. And our charter requires odd year elections for our government, local government offices. So those are the two things that we have heard about that are on our radar. But again, we'll get into all of that. So at the super high level, there were these edits that came to Chapter 4, mainly related to ranked choice voting. And there was a fair amount of back and forth. And you'll see on the slides as we go through, the legislative history is below each section. And you'll see a lot of languages, a lot of edits, a lot of revisions over the years. And a lot of that came as a result of doing a very deep dive into our charter when we were preparing for ranked choice voting, and doing the sort of cleanup that would be required to modernize our language, but then also to make the conversion to ranked choice voting. And you remember probably that it was on the ballot twice so far, and both times it was adopted by the voters to continue to be in the form of voting and then to stay the form of voting. So twice now, the voters have decided they want to have ranked choice voting in the city. So
question.
yeah.
Going back to Rod's comment, or just to the example that he gave about amending the charter for the tap room. Why is that? How do you know, like, what would be a change to the charter and what would be just a new ordinance? Like, why did that involve amending the charter and not just passing an ordinance that would allow it? Was there something in the charter that prohibited specifically?
Yes. So Chair and members, the charter had very specific language related to alcohol, and state law has very specific language related to alcohol in charters and the voting threshold to do so. As I learned during that process many years ago, there was a desire when the charter was being put together and when the city was becoming a modern city in the 60s-ish, there was a desire to prevent bars from being like saloons from existing in Bloomington. And having wet versus dry cities was a very big deal. And you had to vote to become a wet city. So if you look at the northern border of Bloomington, it sort of goes like this. And there are little properties that go up and down. And there was a fair amount of line moving and history about the city related to alcohol regulation.
So if it's not in the charter, it's regulated by essentially.
Chair members, there is the state law, the federal law, state law, and then the charter. I'm trying to figure out like how deep to get on the reads on this. So when charter cities, some charter cities are very, very old, like Minneapolis and Ramsey County, Hennepin County, are charter counties as well. But there was a modern charter model that was created in the 60s, 70s, and rolled out, and many cities adopted the model charter. And so if you look at other cities that are suburban, like, for example, Robbinsdale or Richfield, they have like the same structure. They're talking about the same sort of topics in the same, like, chapter 4 in most of them is, it just follows the same because many of them started from the same. And whatever was going on in the world at that time, they decided that these were the things that charters should address. And when the charter was originally prepared, it was a document that came through the citizens. And so that was what the citizens of Bloomington also thought needed to be in the charter. So it's a very grassroots document, but informed by the model code that was circulating at the time, in the world at the time. Yeah. There was also model city codes as well. So like if you're looking for liquor, it's almost always in 13. So there's just like things like that have happened over time. All right, any other questions before we get started? So I want to just make sure everybody knows that we have the city clerk here. Thanks so much to Jamie for being here. She's extremely knowledgeable and survived the last election. And so I would want to encourage her to jump in repeatedly whenever she wants. And you can also, through the chair, obviously ask questions. I have no pride of answering them if Jamie is the better person to answer. Similarly with Peter. Peter has lived and breathes the ranked choice voting and has a deep knowledge of the language as well. So I'm not the only one who can answer questions tonight, although I'm happy to. The other thing to know is that by way of background, there's a lot of state law on elections, and as you'll see in our charter, we general election laws apply. And then there's also administrative rules at the state level, and they also apply. And they dictate all kinds of things from the size of the font to ovals and, I mean, very, very detailed regulations. So this document is at a very high level in many cases, but also very, very specific in others. So with that, let's go to the next slide. All right, so 4.1, regular municipal elections. I wanted you to see here, obviously the cadence of it after the first Monday, like we're all accustomed to as Americans, and then odd numbered years in the city elections. Municipal elections are an odd number year. The other thing I wanted you to know is the council has to designate where the elections are held, and that is in our charter here. Jamie or Peter, you want to add anything? All right, nothing in 4.2. 4.3, next slide. So the other thing is there are general elections, and then if it's not a general election, then it's going to be a special election. So for example, if there's a vacancy on the council, somebody resigns, moves away, something like that, it creates the need to have a special election. There is a specific procedure both in our charter, but also in state law about how that happens. Ours is not terribly onerous, and there's all kinds of very, very specific calculations about how that happens in state law.
I have a question on this. Is that, the language with respect to the official newspaper, that used to have a Bloomington Sun Current.
Mm-hmm.
Now I think it's Sun Current, assuming that they're still in business 6 months from now. Is that, what is our official newspaper?
Chair and members, the official newspaper for the city of Bloomington is the Sun Current, and annually, we did it last Monday night. We declare what is the official newspaper. There is state law on how you figure out what that is. It has to be a newspaper of general circulation within the jurisdiction, a couple of other things. And so we periodically will look at the rates in the circulation. The last time I looked at it, it was affirmed that we would continue to use the Bloomington Sun Current, based on, for lack of a better term, the saturation in the city of Bloomington.
And so there's enough distribution of the Sun Current within the Bloomington community that that the council feels comfortable that if someone wants to read something, that it's going to show up on their doorstep.
Theoretically, yeah. Chair and members, the other thing that we usually look at, the main ones that are often used are a trade magazine called Finance and Commerce, where a lot of like foreclosures and things are published. And then the Star Tribune, and the Pioneer Press, and then the local newspaper, if there is one. I think, the world is a very different place than it was when all these official newspaper requirements came to be. And the city recognizes that. And just like you can get our agenda packet in the mail, you can also get our agenda packet on the city's website. And so everything that's required to be posted in the official newspaper is also on the city's website. It's the city website /notices, and they're all there whenever they're needed to be posted and the time that they're needed to be posted, along with live links to the actual text of the ordinance or the resolution or whatever that's being discussed. So we comply with the requirements on the official newspaper, but the substantive interaction is happening through mailings and through postings on the internet. All right, next slide. Filing of candidates. We did a fair amount of editing on this. I shouldn't want to say editing, it was editing, but modernization. There was a fair amount of discussion on 4.4 over the years, as you can see from the legislative history. Some things that I wanted to point out to you is any eligible person, or excuse me, an eligible person can file an affidavit of candidacy. There was some cleanup that occurred with regard to that language to make it a little bit more clear. And then the other thing that we did was clean up the language in there related to filing. There was some very specific dates that were in section 4.04, like numbers of days. And we, in consultation with the Charter Commission, concluded that the applicable filing schedule would be a more durable way of referring to that. It's because if the legislature changed their dates, we would then have to do some editing of our charter, or our charter would be out of step and we wouldn't be able to comply with both. So that was a change that was made. And then there was a lot of discussion in years past about the fee and what was the right amount of the fee. It ranges throughout the state, but this $50 fee was the one that was ultimately put in the charter. The city has to prepare and pay for the ballot. This becomes a consideration when we talk about the timing of our elections and the need to have a primary election. It's many tens of thousands of dollars to put on an election. And so preparing the ballots is a part of that cost. And then similarly, the party designation is not a part of the municipal candidacy on the ballot. Any questions? Anything you want to add?
And just looking around the room, probably most folks weren't around when we had the conversation with the fee, but this was back before we had ranked choice voting, when we had primaries. We had a fairly regular occurrence where someone would file in an election and trigger a primary. Maybe you have 3 candidates for a particular seat on the council, but then one of the people wouldn't actually do anything. They wouldn't campaign, they just would do nothing. And as Melissa mentioned, it costs a bundle of money to run a primary election, and to run a primary election when people aren't even putting any effort into going and doing it. Back then it was $2. So it was literally nothing. We had a conversation at the Charter Commission that we didn't want that. And so the we shifted from $2 to $50 to more kind of test to see would that make people think about that a little bit. When the voters adopted ranked choice voting, the filing fee no longer kind of has that same behavior. So but that's the history behind the filing fee change, was that some of us got tired of spending our tax money on elections where they wasn't really a useful thing to have.
Next one. Again, what I mentioned before, this is a statement that the general election laws apply. This actually became something that was a part of our ranked choice voting arguments before the state courts and trying to suss out some of what the law meant. Next slide. This is a term of art, the canvassing of elections. The council must meet and canvass. There's a very specific time period in state law in which that has to happen. Often results in a Friday night council meeting or Saturday morning. And then they declare the results, that gets filed. The clerk is the custodian of all of these ballots, and they have to do all kinds of things to keep them secure, and make sure that everything is counted and coordinated and all the things that you would expect. Any questions about the canvassing of elections? All right, next slide. Language about ranked choice voting. Some things to note here. It is only the mayor and the city council. And that is the extent of it under the law right now. And that is what our charter reflects. And then also that we are able to adopt, the council is able to adopt rules and regulations related to the procedures. So our city code has a lot more detail about how we're going to do this election. So for example, we made an amendment recently, was it last year or the year before, about how many names, how many blanks there were going to be. And that was informed by a whole variety of things, including fitting it all on the page. So a lot goes into producing and preparing these ballots, and sometimes you have to make tweaks. And so this charter provision allows for those adjustments to be made. Okay, next slide. Chapter 5, which I mentioned in our opening introduction. This is, we're not going to have time to get into it on purpose. There's 20 sections. We did a fair amount of editing of this section, of this chapter rather, back in 2021. We received feedback from people that, or we would have challenges figuring out whether somebody was intending to do certain things, that accomplish certain things as allowed by Chapter 5. So there was a fair amount of procedural, like, I don't want to say cleanup, but like giving them samples, sample form of petition, so that it would help them, help a person who wants to utilize the options under Chapter 5 be more successful in meeting very, very specific requirements. So a lot of those changes came in there, and before we could have a conversation about it, I would really like folks to take a look at it. One thing I'll just mention that came up internally in looking at this chapter. I mean, two things I want to say. One is that not every charter city has all three powers. Not every city has the same powers. So this charter commission may decide that it wants to remove or amend some of the authority to bring these types of actions. The other thing that has been talked about is the percentages that are required in order to initiate some of these measures. They have significant impacts, and there was a suggestion that the Charter Commission may want to pay attention and have perhaps a discussion the next time we get together about whether these percentages to meet the threshold for these petitions to move on to the later stages are still the right percentages in this state in, you know, in 2025. So those are the two things that have risen up internally that I thought would be relevant to mention to you. We did a fair amount of research during the ranked choice voting litigation related to powers and what was intending to happen, and similarly with organized collection, and had done a fair amount of review of a lot of other cities' charters to see what powers they had relative to ours. So just something to be aware of. The other thing I'll add is that if you have things that you would like me to be prepared to talk about in detail, the next time we talk about chapter 5, I think that would be really helpful to know in advance. Because I want to, one, do a good job, but also because it's a big chapter and it's really, really the heart of a charter city. It is reserving these powers only for the citizens, and it's very grassroots. And so I want to make sure that we can have a qualitative discussion. Anything else on chapter 5?
Quick question, do you expect that that's going to be more than one meeting likely?
Totally up to you.
I mean, there's a lot, I'm guessing that it may be go beyond that.
Chair and members, there's a fair number of sections that repeat themselves, like the form of, those are pretty quick. And then after our cleanup, there's a fair amount of repetition based on what procedure people are trying to do. But I'd also be interested to hear feedback on whether you think it's understandable. Because of all the chapters, this was one that we'd want to make sure is super understandable for people.
In preparation for that, I think one thing I'd be curious to bring back is insights into like the percentages. So for instance, 15% of total number of votes cast for that referendum petition, stuff like that.
What are the numbers on that?
Yeah, just if there's historical context as to
Yep.
how we're derived and maybe some of the meaning behind those thresholds.
Chair and members, I can certainly try to find, I certainly can do the math with Jamie's help.
You know, if like those were based on, you know, some of the stuff in the charter, as we talked in some of the previous meetings, is based on just like has historical context, and I didn't know if maybe there was something like that, so.
Chair and members, I can certainly dig into that.
Any other questions on that before I move on?
Right, so I will defer to you all if you want to move on to chapter 6. I prepared it because I thought, one, particularly relevant, has a lot of stuff in there about the city manager. But then also, I thought we could probably have enough time to tackle it during this meeting. So, all right, I'm seeing nodding heads. Next slide.
And we should probably mention, if you didn't see the news, that our city manager has
Oh, yeah.
resigned and is now the head of Catholic Charities. So we have acting city managers.
Yeah.
So when you say it's particularly right, that's because we're in a process of just the very early stages of selecting these managers.
So right from the headlines. Right, so this is chapter 6, administration of city affairs. And not a terribly long chapter, but it really is pretty heavy on the substance. So next slide.
There you go.
So city manager, if you think about the org chart, the city manager is sort of like the COO, CEO of the organization. It is this position is the only employee of the city council. The council chooses the manager. And you'll see here, the manager doesn't have to be a resident at the time of appointment. They are appointed for an indefinite period of time, and they can be removed by the council at any time. It is not unheard of for a meeting to start, and there will be a request to a motion to amend the agenda to add removal of the city manager our city administrator to the meeting, and then the city and sometimes the city manager is terminated. It's not unheard of, super unfortunate when that happens sometimes, if it's a surprise, but our charter has a very specific process laid out for how long and what removal looks like, and reinstatement, and lots of process. So our charter, and I didn't go and look at what happened in 88, but maybe something happened in 88 that that in another community that suggested that this should be added. So with regard to the final sentence here, there is a structure in place, and under ordinary times, there is the assistant city manager deputy, which is oftentimes fills in for the vacancy of the city manager. If you tuned in to item 3.19 on the consent agenda on Monday night, that was the council designating interim city managers. And so that's important for all kinds of things. You'll see in the charter as having very specific duties and responsibilities, not only in this chapter, but throughout the city code and other circumstances as well. Next slide.
So just a little bit more of a comment. You talked a little bit about city managers started being let go. Just for historical context in Bloomington, since the charter was adopted in 1960, we've had 3 city managers in 65 years. And none of them have been left on their own volition. 2 of them retired and one of them went where his heart told him to go. It's been,
Because
pardon me?
because 1988 would be towards the end of John Pigeon's.
Yeah, it would have been
Yeah,
the Pigeon.
would have been.
Yeah. Because it's right at the end there, because Pigeon was a manager, I think, for 37 years, I think. But yeah, Bloomington, one of the reasons why, like, if you hear the mayor talk about the city manager position, it really is, for a lot of people, their dream job to come be the city manager of Bloomington, because it's so stable. And it's an interesting place to work, and it's considered to be well-run. And so it shows, because we've only had 3 people that have done it. They've stuck with it forever. It typically is a job where people will take the job and it's going to be their final job until they retire. So.
If someone is terminated, it doesn't have to be with just cause, does it?
No, it's just you piss off 4 council members. And
And the reason you're pissing them off
yeah,
might or might
that's
not be.
right. That's right. And Mark Bernhardson used to say to me that his job was to keep 4 city council members happy. He said it didn't have to always be the same 4. It could change over time. So.
All right, so this next section, 6.02, it's, I felt like when I was reading this, I was like, it sort of pretends like it's specific, but it's very high level. There are some things, but they're, you know, like COOs here in charge of the direction and administration, enforcement, they control the administration. They have to attend all the meetings unless they're excused, all the meetings of the council. They recommend the matters that the city council is going to be taking action on. And that is thankfully or conveniently what the process is also in writing for the rules of procedure for the council as well. Sometimes people will ask, how do I get an item on the agenda? Well, there is a very specific process to get an item on the council agenda. And the city manager recommending it is one of the ways. The city manager is also responsible for the financial condition, and they have to prepare and transmit an annual budget. Our charter contains some specific language about that budgeting process and amending that budgeting process. And then the adoption of the administrative code, which in Bloomington is our city code. And then, you know, the all encompassing other duties as required, parent or assigned. Any questions?
Questions? One thing I'll just point out here is that the section hasn't changed.
All right, the next section, 6.03, this Bloomington is one of the very few cities that has a merit system. And it's one of those areas of, that there aren't a lot of other cities. I can't remember, Peter, are two other cities that have a merit system?
Want to say like Brooklyn Park maybe, or there's a northern suburb that's one, and then one I think in like southern Minnesota.
Yeah, not very many other cities that have a merit system. So we have, the council established this merit system. It's also exists in our city code. And it covers regular employees, and the city manager, the city attorney, the assistant city manager, and the deputy city attorneys and the assistant city attorneys are not covered. So there is, in our employment rules, there's the folks that are covered by the merit system, and then there's a page of rules for the people that are not covered. The other thing is that we have a merit board, and it's a small board of 3 people that the council appoints from the people of the city. And they have very specific powers that are further described here. And they have hearings when there are alleged violations. They have very specific powers related to the employment rules and regulations, and meet once a month, and then as needed,
We meet quarterly.
quarterly. Any questions about the merit system?
One question, I have to emphasize this, I have no opinions about the merit system or not having the merit system, but is removing the merit system something that the Charter Commission could recommend? I mean.
Chair and members, the Charter Commission could certainly recommend the removal of the merit system. I would say that the more commonly existing system is like the classified service, which a lot of communities, a lot of cities have. So we use this merit system format. I've never done a side-by-side to compare and contrast the two of them. Maybe Peter has specific opinions about that. But if before we would do that, or make that sort of recommendation, I would certainly want to do that and see and highlight for you the substantive differences.
Sure. And again, I'd emphasize, this is really out of the blue, but when you indicated that we're one of the few that still have a merit system, it makes me wonder, well, what do others do and why?
Question for Peter, since you attend these meetings on a regular basis, is it, without naming people, but give a couple examples of the types of things that come to the merit board.
Sure, Chair, members. So for example, one of the big substantive changes the merit board considered was in our employment rules, which governs the terms and conditions of employment. When an employee was suspended, demoted, or terminated, they have appeal rights because we are government. Employees have a property interest in their employment. They're afforded due process. And under the old employment rules, that process was handled at the Office of Administrative Hearings through an administrative law judge. And what we found is that process takes a very long time. It's very expensive, upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 to separate an employee. And it could take a year. And so one of the recommendations staff had to the merit board was to change the employment rules to make that process quicker and more cost efficient. And so they have changed it to now utilize our independent hearing officer model that we have in existing code. So that's just kind of one of the changes that they've taken up. Another change that they've taken up is our paid parental leave program or policy. And so because that was a term and condition of employment, that had to go through the merit board for consideration and ultimately to the city council for approval.
So if a person has been suspended or someone starts the process of termination, that individual, can they appeal to the merit board to have a impartial hearing?
Chair members, that is correct. So there's a grievous process that's laid out in the employment rules, and we'll go through a variety of steps. So if it gets to the point of an independent hearing officer, that hearing officer will essentially hold a mini trial where you'll present witnesses, evidence, and the city bears the burden that by a preponderance of the evidence that it had just cause to either suspend or demote or separate that employee. That independent hearing officer will make a recommendation to the merit board. They'll make a findings of fact, conclusion of law. The employee then has an opportunity to actually kind of raise some points or of disagreement with that recommendation to the merit board. The merit board can consider that. And then they can either make their own decision, reduce or change whatever the city decided, or they can uphold that decision.
So over the last 5 years, what's the frequency of that type of an appeal process or hearing of a situation where someone has been either potentially discharged or some other action brought against that person? Is it 10 times, 2 times?
Chair and members, since I've been here, which is 5 years, it's been 1.
I have a much better understanding of what the merit board does now.
There you go.
Yeah, fascinating.
Any other questions about the merit board?
This section talks about the administrative part. Again, pretty straightforward. The council can create departments, divisions, and bureaus. Some city councils in codes have a they'll lay out every single department in the city and get into the structure of every department in their codified code. Bloomington does not do that. We have some offices that are created. For example, the office of the city clerk is created in our code, as is the emergency management director. That office is created in the code. City manager is created. And there are references to things, but there isn't a very specific structure that is codified by the city council in the current structure of our city. Next slide.
Emily?
Quick question on that. It gives them the power to create that. What about dismantling?
Chair members, they could alter their powers, so they could also remove them. This is what I was seeing up there. The office of the city clerk is established. This is because it is a council's usually charter created office. When the city clerk position is vacant, we have to name who that city clerk is. The city clerk has very specific duties and obligations in the law, not too dissimilar to the level of requirements for the city manager. Every city's structure is a little bit different, but in some cities, the clerk has to sign everything. In Bloomington, they can delegate that, or they assign that to the recording secretary. But in some cities, the city clerk is signing every single thing. Our city clerk signs a lot of things as well, but this is just an example of the creation of that specific office. Anything you want to add, city clerk? Happy to be created. All right. So this is this section 6.06 and 6.07. We have talked about a fair amount as a charter commission. There have been some tweaks. These next couple of sections talk about, and I know the chair has some more history on them. But essentially they create a structure for the execution of documents. And they use the structure, they default rather to the structure that is in state law, which is called the Uniform Contracting System, I believe. Chapter 471, 345, and it breaks out dollar amounts, sort of tranches of dollar amounts and the level of process that's required. And what we have done in the city of Bloomington is sort of overlay that with the structure that we use to execute documents. So the city manager can execute documents up to $175,000. And then above $175,000 has to be executed by the city council. It's more nuanced than that, but that's sort of the essence of it. And the city mayor does not have independent authority to execute a contract unless the city council adopts it. Whereas the city manager can execute a document below $175,000 because it isn't required by law to have been done by the city council. Does that roughly make sense? And so periodically over time, things cost money, different amounts of money, and the dollar amounts that are in state law get updated. And so we periodically will look at our dollar amounts and make sure they still make sense. We have a matrix about the process that's required based on the dollar amount. And then we also have this is outside of the charter, but just because it's relevant. We also have financial management policies and procurement policies and purchasing policies that add greater gradation to how one can purchase and the approval process that's required. All of that is flowing up to and from these next couple of sections in the city charter. And when they are amended, when there's a desire to amend them, the council has to do that. So if we amend our financial management policies, it's the council that's taking that action. The other thing that's on here is the ability to delegate to department heads. So at the city of Bloomington, up to $50,000 can be signed by a department head or the assistant city managers. And the other thing that we've talked about here is that the city attorney has to review and approve every contract, which means a whole bunch of things. But one thing that it means is that we know how many there are every year. And we almost crossed the 1,000 contract threshold this year. And I think we're just a couple below that we executed. A lot more were started, but a couple were abandoned before they got signed. So that's the numbers that we're dealing with a lot of reviewing and approving. There's a structure underneath the city attorney's signature that creates a review and approval process. We talked about this in previous meetings. The division head has to approve, and then it goes up. Well, the attorney has to approve, and then before it starts the execution process, the division head has to approve it, and then it goes out to the vendor, and then it comes back to me, and then it goes to either the department head or the city manager or the mayor to sign. So there's a whole structure in place to make sure that things are being done according to the law and to our own financial management policies. Anything more you want to add?
And if you think that sounds cumbersome, these processes aren't unusual in business. So like I did a purchase order of work for a little bit under $1 million fall or something, and it required 5 people. They had to get around to 5 people to get approval. So it's not at all unusual for that sort of workflow to end up happening in organizations.
I'm a firm believer of plain English, and I think that all documents, especially something like the charter or constitution, should be written in language that an ordinary person can understand. But 6.07, has anyone ever considered writing that one, or 6.06 also, in active verbs?
Yeah.
Passive. There's a second sentence in 6.06 that it's 67 words long. Any sentence more than 25 words. You've been just doing, the city manager and the mayor must sign contracts and bonds. Only the city manager must sign these. I mean, even making those changes would make this accessible to more people in the city, which is important. People should know what the city charter says.
Chair members, I see that you have another member you want to recognize.
Mr. Barnes, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm late.
No problem.
Great, glad you're here.
Watching the line of traffic going on the freeway and wondering how many people would be here to.
Ah, Chair members, I think that's an excellent suggestion for everything that we do and how we do it. We have had discussions about that in the past and try to do that in our writing in general, modern drafting that we do. It would be the prerogative of the Charter Commission to direct me to do that. And if you want me to.
Can we hold that thought until the end here and have that as a little topic of conversation at the end?
All right, next section. Why don't we do 6.07 a little bit? This is again, it's saying that the city manager is the chief purchasing agent. I've often wondered, there's not a lot of difference now between 6.06 and 6.07. It also could probably be tidied up, and there's a lot of repetition between the two. But it talks about a lot of the things that I talked about both of these kind of together. You all did make a change that allowed me to delegate the signature authority to another licensed attorney under certain terms and conditions. And so there is a delegation memo that I prepared after you all authorized that to happen. And it sets out the terms and conditions under which I'm authorized to delegate. We have a process in place wherein that happens. And oftentimes I delegate to Peter and he signs when I'm out of the office for 3 or more business days, and some nuance on that. One of the things that Peter and I have talked about is, should that delegation be changed? One of the things that the Charter Commission has talked about is, should we broaden how that current delegation policy is drafted to say, to take a particular approach, for example, that contracts under $50,000 could be signed by the attorney that reviews them. So that might not always be me. That might be one of the assistant city attorneys. It wouldn't be Peter, wouldn't be me. That's just one of the things that we've been talking about is there a way? I will say that there are also benefits to the current structure in that, because I see every single contract, I notice, like, for example, this is a silly example, but it's very simple and easy to understand. I sign lots and lots of contracts with a particular person. Her name, I know her name right now. I sign a lot of contracts with her, and they're smaller contracts. And I called up the originator and I said, "Who is this?" Her name is Pauline. "Who is this? Who's Pauline?" We enter into a lot of contracts with her for doing a whole bunch of different things. Could we just do one contract? And then we just agree in advance that we're going to pay Pauline this amount every time we ask her to do the following 8 things. And so we had a conversation and we cleaned that up. But because I see every one of them, I'm able to do that and notice that. Similarly, we have other situations where that is also the case. You just see things because, and then, it also creates just a lot of opportunity to know what's going on too. And I can ask, if I see something that doesn't make sense, and I, periodically ask Peter questions like, why did you make that choice? Help me understand why you made that choice. And then I know what's going on as well. So there is a helpful function to it too. Next slide.
Just one thing I want to point out here, and you mentioned kind of a little bit of history. If you look down on the bottom and that kind of list of changes, and you see that this section and the next section have the change from 1987. And the 1987 change is one of the changes to the charter that was a reaction to something that happened, and it was the initial mall contract, which Cynthia, you remember because you were around for the mall contract. And the mayor at the time went and kind of cut a deal on the mall, kind of back of napkinish kind of deal. That was the initial kind of contract for the mall, and it wasn't clear in in the charter whether the mayor at that point had that power. And so the charter commission, ended up kind of changing the charter to kind of clarify that because of that particular situation. And so I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that sometimes changes in the charter are reactions to things that happen, and these sections reflect that event happening.
It's great. That's great history. Thank you, Chair. All right. I wanted to highlight a couple of things on here. The council awards those contracts that are over 175 that we have to do competitive bidding on. Some things to just know about is that it doesn't happen very often, but every now and then the council will reject all bids, or there will be a staff recommendation to reject all bids. That can happen for a whole bunch of different reasons, but one of the reasons is if there isn't enough money to pay for it. There isn't the budget. So there's oftentimes an engineer's estimate about how much something's going to cost. And then if they go out for bids and the world has changed, or they didn't realize a really important thing was present that wasn't accounted for in their estimate, and the bids come in and they're way out of reach for what was budgeted. The council has the authority to just reject them all. So that's an important power that the council has. The other thing I wanted to highlight is this notion of the lowest responsible bidder. And oftentimes there's a notion that the government has to contract with the cheapest bidder. And while that's often also the lowest responsible bidder, every now and then there are situations where when the bid is being reviewed, we find out that the bidder is on the debarment list or something like that. Or if the bid has characteristics where the people that are reviewing it, it's like, $1 million cheaper than everybody else's bid. Like why? Maybe they didn't think of something. Is that a responsible bid? So just to know that there's more than just the cheapest bid. It has to be the lowest responsible bid. All right. Next.
With emphasis, I assume, on responsible.
I mean, it's obviously a squishy term, but yeah, I mean, it does come up every now and then.
And I remember so on for HRA and sometimes there'd be a developer that you just know is probably not, given their size and capable of doing the project. You'd be the lowest bidder among the lowest bidders, probably not the responsible.
Yeah, potentially.
Responsible decision to go.
Yeah, potentially.
What's the letter contract to award?
Award, yeah. But to your earlier point, good point.
Yeah.
All right.
Word.
Yeah. All right, that's it. So a reminder of the calendaring. Next slide is the teeing up the question here. And then I know that Adrian pulled you all on a bunch of dates. We will not be meeting on any additional Thursdays in January. If you had a hold on them, those dates aren't going to work for us to meet, to continue our periodic review. And so, Ron, were you able to pull numbers for February and March?
Yes, yeah. Not everybody replied. I don't have exactly who I did get right now, but
You,
a lot of people.
okay,
I think it looks like it's gonna be April.
okay.
For people who replied, it looks like April is when most people are free.
Okay, great. So we will, if you haven't already replied to Bronwyn, please do that so that we can make sure we have a quorum. And then we'll send out a save the date. And just a reminder that the packet comes out on, we changed our rules so it doesn't come out so many days in advance. But this particular time, and we'll endeavor to do it next time as well, to get it to you as soon as possible. And obviously also meeting our rules, but just to remind you that we're going to be talking about chapter 5 and you can start looking at it tonight. The other thing is that our annual meeting date, you all set that last year, and that's May 1st. So if you are able to join us on May 1st, that would be great because that's the annual meeting. Lots of stuff happens at that meeting.
Did you say you were going to be sending around a list of charter members and phone numbers and all that, or was it a package?
Chair and members, we have a list Bronwyn, did you bring that list?
Yeah, it's okay.
We have it. We'd like everybody to take a look at it. It has people's cell phones and work phones on there, so we didn't necessarily wanted to make sure that it was correct. It hasn't been updated in a while, so we didn't want to have a bunch of copies circulating around if it had out of date in it. So if you want to take a look at it before you leave to make sure your information is correct, that'd be great.
Going back to the review, Karen did have a suggestion that we consider taking, I don't know, maybe it would be 6.6, 7, and 8 and see if there's a combination of those, rewriting that makes it. I wanted to get the sense of the group to see if they felt like we ought to consider it. And I didn't hear any substantive changes. It's more about making it so that people, it's more. Go ahead, Rod.
Yeah, to Karen's follow-up there, just looking at 607, is that, and maybe it's the way I comprehend information. But if that was broken into 4 different areas with some spacing in between, is that I probably would not be overwhelmed with the legalese without changing a word.
Yeah. But I'm not hearing an objection, so I think discussion, kind of the lightweight edit that Rod talked about putting some paragraphs in there, or maybe something a little bit more substantive than kind of together, but I didn't hear anybody proposing, hey, I want to change how this works. It's more keeping the same meaning.
And then, so chair and members, given that we're probably going to meet in April, would that be something that you might want me to bring to you in April for your
It was ready.
a look at?
Yeah.
That's good.
Great. Anything else on the charter review before we're done with? Not hearing anything, we'll move on to adjournment. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Don't move.
Is there a second?
Second.
And seconded, all those in favor?
Aye.
For the record, that was Thorson and Hunt.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Nods, got it.
I'm going to turn off the recording. Yes. That mouse is terrible. It's not you. It's,
So all the dates in March are off the table?
yeah, so we were doing a bunch
No
of,
longer social media.
and
They put that.
and we just couldn't quite figure out what Adrian had generated for data. And so I talked to Steve. Skinny down the list of dates that it's polling for.
No, I think it's
Friends, kind of the updated schedules that we knew of, and then I sent out an email with dates, and I think that those were the ones that.
I know, it's not.
Updated dates.
I only asked because I changed